Hey nerdy knitters, welcome to another episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Get your favorite beverage and your knitting and let's settle in and chat about what's on our knitting needles. Now I have two interesting knitting news articles to share. The first one is about the Neutrino knitting app. I don't know if you're familiar with that app. You can check your phone or your device in your Google Play Store or your App Store and look for Neutrino. It's a knitting app that has patterns that you can purchase and use right through the app. Now this is what they have to say about it. We publish new friendly patterns from independent knitwear designers. It's like Google Maps for knitting patterns. Click a stitch to see how to do it, highlight your current place, track your progress step by step, see charts in your yarn colors, see only your size and more. No PDFs, no printing, just purchase your pattern and go. Now, I'm sharing about this app not so much because of the app, but because of something that's happening currently in the world. It's not really knitting related, but it is because of this app. Now, they've joined a lawsuit against Apple because of the monopoly that Apple has on their app store. I have some notes to reference here because there's quite a few details. It's a problem with app developers. When you create an app, you submit it to Apple and they need to approve it. And the same goes for the Google Play Store. And Neutrino listed their app in both locations for approval. Google approved them right away, but they had to jump through some hoops with Apple. They did finally get approved, but they did have issues because you purchase your pattern through their app, but then they also have physical things that you could purchase from their website. So you couldn't purchase those through the app. And that's an issue with Google. They don't really like that. I think they prefer you to purchase things through their app because they take 30% cut. So if you buy a pattern through Neutrino, Apple takes 30% of that profit. So Apple had initially rejected them and they had to jump through some hoops to get things worked out. So there's sort of this stranglehold that Apple can have on app developers. And this is a form of income for these two women developing this app and creating it. And Apple has a very strong presence because if you have an Apple device, you can't download an app in any other location. It has to be downloaded through their app store. So there's no way around this sort of monopoly that Apple has created for their devices. A lot of people believe that there should be more free development, that people that have, after they purchase a device, they should be able to get apps from other locations as well without that Apple stranglehold. So the Neutrino company has joined this lawsuit against Apple to sort of end this monopoly they've created. Because once you purchase a device, it's yours and you should have a little more say in what goes on that device. So while not technically knitting related, I just thought it was interesting because it is about a knitting app and the process that you have to go through to create an app and get it listed in these locations. Next is about washing wool garments in the snow. I thought this was so interesting. I saw this last year as well. Some pictures from, I can't remember what country, it was somewhere in Europe. It was freshly fallen snow on the hedges outside her door, and she just laid her sweaters out in the snow and let more snow sprinkle down on top of them. And that is a form of freshening up your sweater without having to put it in the washing machine on a gentle cycle, of course, or hand washing it and wringing out all that water. Because wool garments, you don't have to wash them all that often. But sometimes it's nice to refresh them, and putting them in the snow is one way to do that. So there's an article linked below with a video that shows you how Clara Parks has done this on her wool channel. Now this would also be a great way to refresh wool blankets because sometimes they're harder to wash. So this would be a great way to get them freshened up on the nice snowy day. Next is our knitting questions. We have a few questions this week, but before we dive into those, I just wanted to say if you have any insight or further thoughts about any of these questions, please leave your comments and continue the conversation because I certainly don't know everything and I learn so much from the comments that people leave. So if you have anything to share, please add it down below. Our first question is from Scoots C. Using your pattern for an easy triangular shawl, which starts with cast on 3 and then a setup row, I want to use a knit 3 yarn over, knit to the final 3, yarn over, knit 3. Do I cast on 7 stitches? Thank you so much. I'm beginning to knit again and have learned so much from your videos. Thank you, Scoots. Now, she is referencing a video for a bottom-up triangle shawl, where you start at the bottom point of the shawl and you increase at both edges to create the triangle shape. And yes, you can certainly change the cast on amount depending on how many stitches you want to start with. The pattern, I think, began with 3 for the sample that I used, just 3 stitches, and then it was knit 1 and then work and increase, knit 1 for the body, work and increase, and then knit 1 for the other edge. But she wants to cast on 7 so she can start with her edge stitches right away, and that's perfectly fine. So if you want to cast on with all of your edge stitches and the start of the body as well, then yes. And in her example, she could have 3 edge stitches on each side and then 1 stitch to start the body, and that would be 7 stitches. So she could knit 3, work her increase, knit that body stitch, work an increase, and then work the other 3 edge stitches. Perfectly fine to do that. So a bottom-up triangle shawl is a really great shape because it's really simple. There's no garter tab cast on. You just cast on a few stitches and start right away. So the next question's from Anne. I've been trying to figure out how to adjust my stitch count for working with cables so I don't get, and she's got 2 parentheses side by side showing like things that get squished in, you know. Is there a formula? Any help would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Okay. Now, yes, there's not really a formula, but there will be swatching involved. Noragon, in her Knitted Cable Source Book, a fabulous book, by the way, calls this the stockinette stitch equivalent. What you need to do is knit a swatch in stockinette stitch. And then if you have the cables you've chosen already, knit a swatch in those. And that's going to be a denser fabric because cables use more stitches but take up less space because they do squish in. So you need to compare the 2 swatches. You need to get your measurements for your stockinette swatch, measure over 4 inches, 6 inches, whatever you want. Get the stitch count for that, then measure over that same area of the cable swatch to determine how many stitches in that cable. Or measure the whole cable, depending on if it's a cable fabric or if it's like just a rope cable. Measure the cable itself to see how wide it is and how many stitches you use. So you're going to have to adjust your stitch count for whatever your garment is. If it's a plain garment and you're adding some cables to it, you're going to have to add some stitches so you don't get that suckage where the thing squishes in because of cable fabric. So you're going to have to swatch. There's not really a formula for this. There's just simple math to figure out the stitch count of the cables in that amount of space compared to the stockinette. So if your sweater is in a plain stockinette fabric and you want to add, say, a 4-inch wide cable, then knit that cable, measure it, see how many stitches are in that 4-inch area compared to your stockinette area, and add the difference of that stitch count. You want to add that number of stitches to your cast on, or make sure you adjust your stitch count at some point. So when you get to the place where that cable is going to be, you have enough stitches to work it and you can avoid getting that compression that cables cause. And another thing to consider when doing cables is if you're having groups of cables and you have reverse stockinette stitches in between, that can also make it compressed because it almost acts like a ribbing. So you don't want to consider just the cables themselves. If you're going to have lots of cables, swatch the whole thing and then see how much that compresses and measure that. See how many stitches you have there compared to regular stockinette. And you'll know how many stitches you need to add to compensate for that compression. Next question is from Natalie. Someone at my knit night group wanted to teach me German short rows. I tried it, but are German short rows really necessary? No, not at all. You can choose whatever short row technique that you want. If you want to use one all the time, then you can. Sometimes though, a designer will pick a specific short row method because it fits that design. For example, you might use wrap and turn short rows in garter stitch fabric because you don't have to pick up the wraps. You can just leave them there and they'll hide in the garter stitch fabric. So in situations like that, that might be why a designer would choose that type of short row. But sometimes it's just a plain stockinette stitch sweater and it's got some short rows. You can interchange them and use the one that you prefer. But you might have to compensate for the type of short row because some short rows you have to work the slipping the stitch and wrapping the stitch, whatever is done to minimize that hole. Sometimes that's done before you turn the work, like in a wrap and turn short row. You get to the point of where that short row is going to be and you slip your stitch, you wrap it with a yarn, slip it back, and then you turn the work and work across the row. Other short rows are worked after you turn. So you would get to the point of the short row, you turn your work, and then you work a short row, like a German short row, and continue that way. So those are a little more difficult to interchange. Like if it calls for a wrap and turn and you want to use a German, the wrap and turn is worked before you turn your work. The German is worked after you turn your work. So you have to consider that in the placement of that short row. So it's a good idea to know two methods, I think. One where you are working the short row before the turn, one method when you work the short row after the turn. So then you can have a few options when you are interchanging them in the pattern, and you won't have to do so much figuring out how to work that short row if you're using one that's completely different than the method that's described in the pattern itself. But no, German short rows are not necessary as long as you have a short row method you like and you're able to use that in most situations. But sometimes the designer will have picked a specific method on purpose. So if you're not quite sure, you can always get in touch with them and find out to see if that method is fine or if they think it's okay to change to something else. Next question is from the Scientific Explorer girl. Does yarn have directionality? I see in many projects people knit from the inside and then the outside of a yarn cake. I'm wondering if you do this, if there's any difference in shading, texture, or otherwise will be introduced into your project as compared to if you would only have knitted from the inside or the outside. Now there's a few things in this question I wanted to discuss. The first is if it's a patterned yarn or some sort of self-striping or a color change yarn. Like I have been working on a shawl recently. You might have seen it in a past episode. I don't have it handy to show right now, where you do have to work it in a specific order. You have to start at the inside of the cake and work outwards because it starts at a very small bit of one color and then it gradually adds more color. So you get stripes they look exactly the same in width, even though each section uses a different amount of yarn. And then it finishes with a very large gray section. About more than half the skein is the gray yarn. So you could start with the gray and then work your way down to that last tiny bit of color, but that one is meant to be worked from one color to the other. And when you turn it from a skein into a cake, then you do have to use it as a center pull ball. So there are yarns that require you to pay attention to where those colors are. If you're not sure about your specific yarn, then check on Ravelry, look at other people's projects and see if there's any notes that they left about how they use the yarn, if it's some sort of patterning or self-striping yarn. And of course, there's always swatching. You can swatch for yourself if it's a particular yarn that you're using. Okay, and the other thing besides color and the self-patterning is the twist of the yarn itself. You can knit from the inside, the outside, and both ways will introduce some twist to the yarn. Now there's lots of discussions on this online, and it all begins with, the yarn is already twisted. It will either have a Z twist or an S twist, depending on how those plies are twisted together. But you can introduce more twist to the yarn depending on if you're pulling from the inside or the outside, or depending on how you turn your work. If you're knitting in the round and you're always turning it this way, then you could be adding more twist to the yarn. The same with if you knit back and forth in rows. If you always turn it the same way, you could be adding twist to your yarn. So I try to make sure if I'm knitting flat, then I turn it this way, then I turn it this way, I turn it back this way instead of trying to go in a circle. If you keep going in a circle, you're going to add some twist. Now this is another time where swatching could be important. You can swatch to see if there's some added twist that's really affecting the fabric or the drape of the yarn. I did find an article on Tech Knitting where she did a little bit of a science experiment to see how much twist was added compared to pulling from the inside of a cake or from the outside. So you'll find a link down below for that as well. If you have any insight into this, then please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Now that was all for questions, so I thought we would continue our discussion about knitting with different fibers. Before we dive into the fiber we're going to talk about, I just want to refresh your memory, if you haven't been here before, about the different categories. Fibers can be divided up into animal fibers like wool, alpaca, silk, plant fibers like cotton and linen, biosynthetic fibers like bamboo, which use a plant source material but require like a synthetic process to turn it into usable yarn, and then synthetics like acrylic, nylon, polyester. So we've discussed linen and wool. So I thought we would just continue our discussion with animal fibers by talking about the camel family. Now there's a few animals in this family. Those include camels, alpacas, llamas, vicuñas, and guanaco. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that one properly, and Paco vicuñas. Now, of course, in Central Asia, we have the wool-producing Bactrian, that's the 2-hump camel, and we don't use the fleece from the dromedary camel, the 1-hump, for yarn. And then in South America, we have the other members of the Camelid family, alpacas, llamas, vicuñas, as well as guanacos. Now, vicuñas are the smallest, and they live wild in high-altitude areas of Peru, and their fiber is highly prized and very expensive, and you'll see why in a second. They are protected species, and the animals, they live in the wild. They're not domesticated. So when they go up in the mountains to find them, they shear them every 3 years, and each of these small animals only produces a pound of wool. So if you find a vicuña wool yarn anywhere, then that is why it's so expensive, because it's protected species. They only shear them every 3 years, and they only produce a small amount of wool, but it's beautiful, beautiful fiber. So I'm told. I've never actually used it myself. And then we have llamas. They are the domesticated and tallest cousin. They're often used as pack animals, and they have a soft undercoat that's very similar to alpaca, but it's not as popular because the guard hairs and the other hairs around it can reduce the amount of softness. And then we have alpaca, and you're probably very familiar with that one. This is also a domesticated animal, specifically bred for their wool and sometimes mistaken for llamas, even though they're smaller than llamas. Then we have another one, a close relative to the vicuña is the guanaco. Now this one has protected status because it's been hunted to near extinction, and it's also wild like the vicuña, and very few are domesticated, so fiber is extremely rare for this type. And then there is a combination breed, a Paco vicuña. This is a cross between the alpaca, which is the domesticated descendant of the wild vicuña, and the vicuña. So the focus is on producing fiber that is fine and as similar as possible to wild vicuña. While native to South America, you can now find them in small farms throughout North America as well. On my someday dreaming list would be to have a small farm somewhere with a few alpacas or some of these Paco vicuñas. I'll put a link down below to an article on my website that has another link so you can see pictures of these animals. They're smaller than alpacas, and I guess they're very friendly and easy to care for. So I think as like a dreaming farmer, that'd be a great animal to start with. And of course their fiber is really, really nice because it's that blend of alpaca and vicuña, which is very, very expensive luxury fiber. So all of these animals are in the Camelid family, and they all share some distinct advantages in their fibers. Very soft and luxurious fibers. If you've ever knit with alpaca, you know how soft and beautiful it can be. Vicuña is supposed to be even better. I wish I had some so I could show you and, well, knit it for myself. Now, they are hollow fibers, which makes them very warm and insulating because warm air gets trapped within the fibers, and that keeps your body really warm. Sometimes people will say alpaca is almost too warm if they have a sweater that's knit in 100% alpaca. It can almost be too warm because those fibers really hold on and make a very good insulation. They also have beautiful drape, and they're water resistant, and they are lanolin free if you have a sensitivity to lanolin. Now, the disadvantages, of course, they are more expensive than a lot of wool or other fibers, and they have a lack of memory and elasticity. So this is that other side of drape. They have beautiful drape, but they have a lack of elasticity. So think of an elastic. You can stretch it out, but then it's going to snap back into shape. These types of fibers won't do that. They will drape, and they might droop and sag if they're too heavy. So this is why you'll often find these types of fibers blended with other fibers like wool, because they add some drape and they add extra warmth as well. Now, that's not to say you can't use 100% alpaca yarns or these other yarns, but I would think about the project you're going to use them with. I would use them for small accessories, especially expensive fibers, and for shawls, things where that drape is an advantage. Now, because of that lack of elasticity, these types of fibers are not interchangeable with a wool yarn, especially in a sweater where you need that wool to add structure to the garment. These don't have the same structure as wool because they're that really drapey and soft and not elastic like wool is. So they're not interchangeable, but you can find them blended with wool to add their wonderful properties. And you'll find a link for an article down below that has some tips on how to block these fibers, or if you're looking for some yarns that include these fibers, then you'll find lots of links for those in that article as well. Now, before I share what I've been knitting, I just want to share about this week's sponsor, which is Annie's Craft Store. Annie's has lots of crafty goodness on there, including knitting, and there's lots of classes and patterns and lots of great stuff. And I was scrolling through their classes and I found one, the Mix and Match Knit Sampler with instructor Kara Gott-Warner. You'll learn 12 stitch patterns, including cables, lace, short rows, mitered squares, and mosaic knitting. Now, each of these 12 stitch patterns includes instructions to knit an 8 by 8 inch sampler swatch, which you can then turn into another project like an Afghan or a tote bag, and then there's instructions for that as well. So if you're a newer knitter and you're looking to explore more stitch patterns, then these sampler things are a really great way to do that. So I'll put a link for that down below. Now let's get to the knitting. My first thing to show is a finished object. I finished my daughter's gloves. Ends are all woven in, everything's been blocked. Oh, you can see where my double pointed needles were. I've got a bit of a line right there, but those will disappear with use and more washings and things like that. So I'm not too concerned. So they came out really nice. I think I actually did the fingers a bit short, but she says it fits just fine. So we will keep them the way they are. And those are all ready in case we get any more snowstorms. Hopefully not, but I'm in Canada and it's still February, so I expect at least 1 or 2 before the end of March. So she's got some new gloves that she can wear while she's out shoveling snow. Pattern and yarn. I always forget that. I just show the things and I forget to talk about the pattern and the yarn. So the pattern was Ann Budd's Handy Book of Patterns. She's got sweaters and hats and even scarves and mittens and gloves in there, and all different gauges and sizes. So you knit a swatch, which I did not do. And then you decide on the size and you just follow the chart for that size and knit your gloves. It's a really great way to fit lots of different sizes and patterns compress them down into one book. So I used Patons Classic Wool Worsted in red, and I didn't swatch because I use that yarn a lot, especially for the Master Knitting program. I used it for almost all of my swatches. So I have a really good idea of what my gauge is for that yarn. And I usually knit sometimes a 7, sometimes an 8, depending. And I went with a US 7 for these. I knit them on double pointed needles. I almost went down to a size 6, but I already tend to knit tightly on double pointed needles, so I thought a size 7 would be fine, and it came out just fine. They fit really well. The only thing I would have done differently is perhaps knit the cuff one size smaller on a US 6 instead of a 7, just to pull them in a bit, but they're fine. It's not that big a deal. And the other thing, maybe just to make them like really nicely finished, would be to maybe do a tubular edge at the cast on point, because it looks lovely when you have a nice little tubular edge. I just use the long tail cast on because these are just for shoveling snow, cold days, things like that. They're nothing fancy, but now I've knit gloves. I've never done that before. That was a first for me, and a bit tedious weaving in all those ends and using the yarn tails to fix holes. But when you're doing each finger and you're casting on for each one, you end up with a tail of yarn between the fingers. So it's really easy to use that to close up the gaps. It just takes time because you've got the yarn tail for each of the points of the fingers, and then you've got the yarn tails for in between each of the fingers. So there's a bit of yarn to weave in there. Now, off my needles is my master sweater. It's off the needles. It's still in pieces. I haven't seamed it. I keep meaning to get to it, but with the Fix Your Knitting Mistakes course that I'm working on right now and is out, we'll talk more about that at the end, but my focus has really been on that, so I haven't really done anything with the Master Knitting program. It's still sitting up on my shelf. Hopefully this weekend, if I find the energy, I will sit down and finally get that seamed up. Then there is the Adventurer's Scarf and Wrap by Ambah O'Brien that I've been working on. I finished, well, I'm still working on the blue, but I'm starting the fading again on this side. So that's all that I have left of my bluey blue. And then I'm fading into this color. So it's coming along nicely. Start it down here with the light blue and fading to this dark blue. And now back down the other way. So this is a really fun pattern. It's sort of, I think it's a 36 row pattern, I think. So I sit down and I just keep working until I finish one whole repeat. And oh, actually I haven't for this one. It got away from me and I had some things I had to stop to deal with. But it's sort of addictive, like you just start and you just want to keep going. So I've made very good progress. So I'm fading in this color now, and I have 2 more colors to fade in after that. So it's looking very nice. And this uses Urth Yarn's gradient set. It's a 200 gram set of 4 different colors. So I divided all of the colors in half, except for the cobalt blue. So I could start at one end, fading from lightest to darkest, and the darkest is in the center of the shawl or scarf. It's not very wide. And then fading back out again to the other side. So that is coming along nicely. Now the next thing on my needles is a new poncho that I'm designing for Biscotte Yarns using their Louise Robert or Louise Robert collection. This is the Merino worsted in Oatmeal. Very soft and squishy. It's a superwash yarn. So this is my progress right now. It's going to be knit in a long rectangle, and then you'll seam the bind off edge to one side to get that poncho shape. So it does pull in because it's a rib pattern. It's a lacy rib. So after it's finished, I will block it to stretch it out, but coming along nicely. I've finished quite a lot actually. I think about 1 skein of yarn. It's a really soft, beautiful yarn. Pattern is really simple. It's basically a rib pattern with 1 row to add the decorative lace. So very simple. Once you know the stitch pattern, I don't even refer to the chart or the written instructions anymore. There's only 1 row that you have to pay attention to, and it's a very easy repeat. So this is really a fun and relaxing knit, even though it looks like there's more involved. It's really simple to do. So this, I think, is going to be lovely when it's really finished. Next thing on my needles is a new sweater for my daughter. So far, all I've done is the swatch. I have not washed or blocked this yet. I want to take my measurements before I do, and I'm using a Brava Sport weight from Knit Picks. Now this is 100% acrylic, and it's machine washable and dryable. So that is what I'm going to do to my swatch, because that's what my daughter is going to do with her sweater. I will encourage her to do it on at least the delicate or hand wash cycle in the washing machine, but it is meant to be washed and dried. So that's what I'll be doing with my swatch as well. After I take some measurements, I like to take the measurements before and after to see if there's any change in the yarn, because then later on when I'm knitting the sweater, if I want to take any measurements while it's on the needles, I'll know what my gauge was before I washed the swatch, so I don't have to wash the sweater in progress. I'm using a pattern from this book, Amy Herzog's Ultimate Sweater Book. This is another one of those lots of, 4 basic sweater constructions, but then she has 3 different yarn weights for each of those patterns in multiple sizes. So it's not just 4 patterns, there's a lot of patterns in here, and you can add whatever elements you want. So I'm using this basic set-in sleeve sweater construction, and she has sections in here that shows you how to add shawl collars, pockets, different edges, stitch patterns, etc. And then she also has patterns in the back, I think 8 patterns, that shows how she takes these basic patterns and adds lots of different things to them to really make unique designs. So I'm using this as the base, and I'm adding a shawl collar and patch pockets on the front. So that is going to be knit in pieces, the 2 cardigan fronts and the back and the sleeves, and then seamed up, and then we'll have the shawl collar and the pockets to add to that. So I haven't made much progress. My goal was to finish the master knitting sweater before I started a new sweater, but technically I've only swatched, I haven't started it yet. And I have one more thing on my needles, and this is one of my favorite bags for around the house knitting. It's Jezebel Bee. I think she's from here in Canada, from Quebec. I like this because I can just put it right over my arm. See if there we go. Like that. She's got different sizes. She's got a larger one. This is the small size. So it's nice for knitting socks, but I do a lot of swatching for designs and, well, the master knitting program. So this is sort of my swatch bag. And right now in there is this swatch, a tuck stitch swatch. This is a new thing. I'd never done tuck stitches before, but I got a book for Christmas that uses them. It's really pretty. I feel like it's a luxurious, like when you've got something all scrunched up around your neck. So this is a swatch for a bandana cowl. You would work this pattern, I think with a wide garter stitch border, and then sort of like a small poncho. You would seam one edge, you would seam the cast on, yeah, I think in this case it's going to be the cast on edge to one side to form like a little bandana style cowl. But I really liked the idea of something like luxurious and squishy against the neck. So that's the initial swatch for the design. I'm going to be submitting the design to Knit Picks. They've got a publication coming up about stash busting projects that use less than 200 grams of yarn. And my thought process was with this, that would be a one skein project. I'm not sure where with the tuck stitches it does like take more fabric, because you are, okay, basically it's done. It's just stockinette stitch. Every right side row, you're just knitting. Most of the wrong side rows, you are just purling. And then you have these special stitches. Okay, she has, let me see if I can try to explain it. This one only uses one tuck stitch method. There's more than one. But on a wrong side row, you're purling to create your stockinette fabric. But then you place knit stitches strategically in there. And then later on, after you've worked a few more rows, you go back and you look for those knit stitches that are worked further down, and you put them up on your needle and you knit them together with another stitch, and that creates this tuck. So it's not cables, nothing to do with cables. It's just sort of squishing the fabric up to create this squishiness. And I've got the book. I don't have the book right here with me right now, but I will show that in another week. But it's a tuck stitch book. If you just look up tuck stitch knitting, I think, then you can find the book. But this uses just that one method to create this interesting fabric. But it's actually really simple to do because it's just garter stitch and stockinette with those occasional knit stitches in there on a purl row. And then every few, I don't know how many rows it was, but a few times you are stopping to look for those knit stitches so you can use them to create these tuck stitches. So it's a really interesting fabric. I'm hoping that Knit Picks agrees with me and will accept that design for their upcoming publication. If not, then I can always submit it somewhere else. So that's all that I've been knitting, everything that's on my needles. I don't have any acquisitions to show. I probably won't have that many. I don't buy yarn to buy yarn. I buy it when I have a project in mind. And right now I've got quite a few things on my needles already and a few projects that are upcoming in the future. But I do like to show knitting resources. And this week's resource is The Knowledgeable Knitter by Margaret Radcliffe. Now, this is what I would call one of those books that is all about creating a well-fitting, finely knit garment. You won't find patterns in here, but you will find lots of technical information, lots of tips about refining a pattern, or even just walking through how to use a pattern to knit a garment that's going to fit you very well. Now, it's really focused on knitting garments, sweaters and cardigans and things like that. The chapters include, the first one is about choosing your pattern, your yarn, and your needles, and gauge, taking the right measurements for your body and choosing the right size sweater, because I often see people knit sweaters that are just too big for them. So she has good information about that. And the second chapter is about planning the project, which I know a lot of us don't like to do. We get that pattern, we get our yarn, we're going to cast on right away. We skip the swatching and we just jump right in. But sometimes if you really want the project to be finished well, then you might need to stop and do some planning ahead of time, thinking about your cast on and your bind off, and do they need to match? What kind of one would look the best? So she talks about stuff like here. So in that second chapter, she talks about like the order of construction for a garment, cast on choices, pattern stitches, planning ahead for finishing, because you do have to think about your finishing before you finish your project. And then chapter 3 is about modifying the pattern, which I know would be helpful to a lot of people, because if you're like me, then you probably never knit a pattern just the way it says. Changing colors and stitch patterns, adding embellishments, changing the borders, converting circular garments to flat, and vice versa. And then there is shaping and fitting, adding borders, understanding knitting instructions, evaluations and adjustments, fixing mistakes, variations in dye lot and color, size and fit adjustments, cutting your knitting, finishing practices, blocking, dealing with ends, joining pieces, and then borders, bindings, and embellishments. There's a lot of good stuff in this book, and it's got lots of great photographs and swatches and techniques, and it's hard to, I would call it a technique book, but it's more about just refining your knitting, I guess. So it's not something that when I'm looking for a technique, I don't jump to this book to look at the techniques, but I like to sit and just read sections of it just to sort of absorb the information, because there's just a lot of good information in here about just refining your knitting process if you're a garment knitter. So that is this week's recommendation, The Knowledgeable Knitter by Margaret Radcliffe. Now we do have an announcement about the Fix Your Knitting Mistakes course. It is open and ready for its first batch of students. There's still space available. I am capping it at 60 students just so I don't have too much feedback. I just want enough to make sure everything is going well, but there's still space. I'll put a link down below so you can go check it out. Right now, there are only 4 modules because I'm going to be releasing the others as I get feedback from these first batch of students. So the first 4 modules, the first 2 focus on reading your knitting, and a lot of people are fine to skip that. They understand how their knitting works and they can skip right to the fixing your mistakes part. But I wanted to include those because for a lot of people, they can't fix their mistakes because they don't know how to read their knitting. So the first module focuses on the very basics, the stitch itself, like the parts of a stitch, how it sits on your needle, how you form a new stitch, Eastern and Western mounted stitches. The second module focuses on looking at that stitch in a variety of stitch patterns, counting your stitches. So those first 2 are just for those basic things to make sure you really understand how knitting works and how to read your knitting, because you can't fix your mistakes if you can't read your knitting. Then we dive into the basics. Module 3 focuses on basic knitting fixes. Tinking back or unknitting, frogging using lifelines, and then the 4th module focuses on dropped stitches and how to pick them up. Stockinette stitch, reverse stockinette, so you learn knit and purl, then how to combine the 2 in garter stitch, so you'll learn how to drop down and fix a stitch. And I have a specific swatch with instructions, so I want you to knit the swatch so you can practice this, and it includes garter stitch, stockinette stitch, knit 2, purl 2, rib, and seed stitch. Just not a huge swatch, but enough to have those 4 different stitch patterns so you can practice all of these techniques. And then next week, the next 2 modules will be added. Those will be fixing sections of stitches, not just dropping down to fix 1 stitch, but dropping down to fix 3 or 4 stitches in stockinette, in garter, in knit 2, purl 2, rib, and in seed stitch. How you would drop down, find your mistake and fix it, and ladder that back up following that specific stitch pattern. And then the module after that focuses on increases and decreases, how they're worked and how to read them, and then how to fix them, how to tink back and how to drop down and fix or add or subtract an accidental increase or decrease. And then the week after that, there will be 2 more modules released. So there's a lot of content in this course. It's 6 modules altogether, plus I call it a final exam, because the final project will be to knit a small lace swatch and then drop down and fix a section of lace and ladder it back up. That's it for this week's episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoy sitting here and chatting with you about knitting and answering your knitting questions. If you have questions that you would love to discuss, leave them down below and we will do them in another episode. And if you're new here and want to watch even more episodes, then check out this playlist of this current season of the podcast. And I'll see you in the next video.